So the Cultural Revolution was really about destroying the past and re-educating people. The objective here was to build a compliance with the Maoist agenda that was being lost over time, in part because of the Great Leap Forward and the failures of the leadership. His biggest concern, however, is going to be the bourgeoisie lifestyle. These are people that are middle income, upper middle income, oftentimes a relatively large group, and they're educated. They are not as dependent upon the government for their support, and they're materialistic in the Marxist scheme of things. They want to pursue more abundance and are willing to engage in the capitalist policies of the past to bring about that better lifestyle. These people pose a threat to the Maoist agenda of communism. And it's important to note that this is a remnant of Marxism, because Marx saw the bourgeoisie as a major threat that needed to be eliminated. When you have a large bastion of poor people, they tend to be more compliant because they oftentimes don't have the means to take on a challenge to the administration, and they also are more dependent on the administration for their subsistence. Whereas with that middle and upper middle income, they become a greater threat to the leadership. And so Mao wants to suppress this. Goes hand in hand with eliminating the olds. For him, the bourgeoisie lifestyle is an old idea, culture, habit, custom, right? A remnant of capitalism. And it goes with re-education. Train them to be less materialistic, to be about the larger collective and less about themselves. Well, regardless of the intent of the Cultural Revolution, the outcome was quite dismal. The economy collapsed with a magnitude at least equal to the Great Leap Forward. Millions died, although less than during the Great Leap Forward, because then you had a famine, right? Here, you have a lot of deaths and executions, but the count is lower, anywhere from maybe 1 to 3 million instead of tens of millions of people. This had an ironic outcome for Mao. His goal was to centralize more power, but he actually unintentionally ends up decentralizing power. As the chaos ensues from the revolution, these smaller regional economies begin to become more self-contained and sufficient. Regional leaders start to have more influence over their particular arenas, and people look less, everyday people look less to the larger national government and more to their local government for direction. At the same time, we're seeing black markets form. So remember, market activity is illegal in China at this time. You know, it's a planned economy. So every business is effectively under the dominion of the government and no trade is allowed. But people are losing touch with the government. And as a result, they are starting to trade. And so at the same time you have decentralization and power, kind of politically, you start to see decentralization in terms of economics as people begin to trade. It's just not legitimized, right? It's in the underground economy, but it's happening. So because of this pragmatism that's occurring at the lower levels of society, the embrace of a larger communist agenda and this utopia somewhere in the future starts to go away. And people begin to seek out more moderate, more practical leaders. And this eventually makes its way to the highest levels. Mao dies in 1976. This opens the door for new leadership. And his successor, Deng Xiaoping, will take the helm in 1978. Deng is different than Mao. He's a pragmatist, a moderate, more along the lines of Liu Shaoqi. In fact, Deng and Liu are often perceived as kind of a counterbalance to Mao's ideologically driven agenda. Keep in mind, however, that Deng is a moderate compared to Mao, not in the broader spectrum of ideas. He still is a socialist economically, and he is not pro-democracy politically. He's an authoritarian figure. And that shows up with the reforms that he puts forth. From 1978 on, we have the reform period, which will bring us all the way to modern China. But it is in these late 70s that we start to see a lot of market-based changes. When Mao died, there was a question mark as to what the future institutions would look like, economically and politically. Economically, it became clear very quickly that markets were going to be replacing a lot of the planning that had gone on before. But politically, there was still ambiguity. Was Deng going to allow for referendums and democracy, or was he going to squelch any sort of political freedom? The answer came June 4th, 1989, in Tiananmen Square, Beijing, where there was a pro-democracy uprising led by a large number of college students. We're talking about thousands of people coalescing in this large square to fight for freedom politically. And Deng sent in the military to subdue the unrest. There were people shot, there were people killed. The most famous example, of course, is this guy. He's known as Tank Man because he thwarted the movement of a brigade of military tanks. This is probably one of the most iconic pictures of 20th century history. So it became pretty clear that political reform was out, but market economic reforms were in. And that's going to allow China to achieve some of the most impressive growth rates in recorded history. 8.5% average annual growth rate from 1978 to 2005. Using the rule of 70, that means the Chinese economy would effectively double about every 8 years with this kind of growth rates. That will allow China to catch up to many countries that had lower growth rates. Most industrialized countries during this period are lucky to achieve 3% average. So China is catching up and will become a major player in international affairs by the 21st century. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, there was a reform movement underway. And it wasn't necessarily government reform. This is important because as the Mao era ended, a lot of the discontent with those policies were met with a spontaneous decentralization, right? Especially among farmers. Farmers in those communes, for example, had to find better ways of operating. The locus of control had went from the national government down to the local governments, and these workers and farmers were partnering with local leaders to bring about better outcomes. And as a result, farmers started to carve out little plots of land within the communes so that they could be more efficient in agriculture. They started taking over a lot of the communes and turning them into profitable enterprises. This is the township and village enterprise system. Remember, the communes were the primary hub for production. Thousands of households sometimes would coalesce by force to produce the output for the national government. And then they would, of course, turn over all that output. Well, at this point, it doesn't make sense to move away from the hubs of production. So people continue to operate in these communes, but they're morphing into businesses. You know, households are now trading with each other, and villages are trading with each other. And they're seeing more efficient production because of the new incentives. That's exemplified by what's called the contract responsibility system. You see, households in the communes were still handing over product to the federal government, but they were keeping any surplus. It's kind of like, well, we'll continue to pay our dues, but whatever increased output we get from this decentralization, we're going to keep it. We're either going to consume it or we're going to trade with each other. So you have these black markets forming and a responsibility still being upheld by the people to the government. Well, the government, they don't like this, obviously. They want people to hand over all their production and they want control over the economy, but it was lost. That decentralization had already taken hold, and like wildfire, it was spreading across the entire system. So Deng is often given credit for being a market reformist, but it's important to note that he may have just been following the lead already ushered in by farmers. There's an old saying that Deng got in front of a parade, right? He grabbed credit for the movement that was already underway that he was not likely able to stifle. Remember, Mao tried to stifle this movement with the Cultural Revolution, and that didn't work. So there's new institutions that are emerging as well. As trade takes place and these markets expand, there's the farmer, trader, entrepreneur that is finding better ways to produce, transport, and sell products. There'll be a need for a contract system, even if it's informal. There'll be a need for some sort of property rights system. There'll be a need for some sort of informal judicial system and a forum for people to borrow and lend, kind of a financial system. Now, all of this, of course, is going to emerge informally outside of the government. But that reminds us of something Hayek talked about, what we call spontaneous order. Institutions will emerge even if they're not government sanctioned, aka deliberate government order. And that's what's occurring in China at this time. Now, eventually, of course, many of these institutions that form informally will become formalized, like the contract responsibility system. But that was informal at first because people just handed over to the government what they were previously handing over or something similar to that and keeping the rest. But by the early 80s, the government's going to say, yeah, you do that. You hand over that quota and then you can keep the rest. Honestly, if you look at history, most societies form through a kind of spontaneous order that starts from a bottom up, but that eventually gets formalized by the government. Now, despite the reforms that are taking place, this liberalization of the economy, the government is still going to maintain control over the commanding heights, what they call the national champions. Things like the oil industry, the banking industry, the heavy steel, iron industries. They're not going to relinquish their dominion over that. With that historical backdrop, we can now study the modern Chinese economy. And one of the most notable features of this is there are still a lot of state-owned enterprises. Now, in the US, we don't see a whole lot of government businesses. We have the public school system. We, of course, have the military. And at the local level, you might have an electric company or water company here or there that is owned by the government. But most of the businesses we deal with are private, right? In contrast, China still has a large number of state-owned enterprises. And these are defined as businesses where the state either directly funds the enterprise or they own a majority of the shares in the stock shares. It makes up about 3% of total enterprise count, which sounds like a small number, but these businesses are really important. They're 90% of market cap. Market cap is the total value of all stock in the country. So 90% of all stock value in China is of the state-owned enterprises. And they also produce half of China's GDP. So it's analogous to what if in the US the government owned Twitter and Facebook? What if the government owned Chevron, right? And General Motors and General Electric, right? These massive companies. Well, they don't. They're private enterprises. But in China, that would be the norm. They also receive favorable tax treatment, access to bank credit, low rates of interest, and other perks. The government takes care of their state-owned enterprises, giving them an advantage over private enterprises. However, these government enterprises are less productive. In fact, they're half as productive as private companies. If you look at the total factor productivity, TFP, the private sector produces twice as much value per unit of input compared to the public sector. This is explicable through the lack of competition that state-owned enterprises face and the soft budget constraints. A private company that wastes resources will have to charge a higher price, and they will eventually be outcompeted by a company that doesn't waste resources. But in the state-owned enterprises, there is no competition. The state has a monopoly. And so if they waste resources and charge a higher price, they continue to operate. They don't go away. This fact suggests that China's economy grew rapidly in spite of the state-owned enterprises, not because of the state-owned enterprises. In other words, they may have been able to grow more rapidly had they privatized a larger array of businesses in their economy.